Okay, great to be here. I will crack straight on. Essential. Well, I'm going to talk about Richard Burton and Sufism, and the central problem with any discussions about Richard Burton, the delight for most of us here, I'm sure, but also the consternation of other people, is all the contradictions in Burton's character. Is he one thing, is he another thing? And there's constant argument, especially amongst academics, because they always want it to be either this or that. And which brings me to a famous Sufi dicta is, life is neither this nor that. So already there's a problem. Anyway, I'm going to read a little bit I've written just to kick off. Though Richard Burton was undoubtedly a Sufi, the real question, which is avoided or missed by all his biographers, including his wife, is what kind of a Sufi was he? And it's because Sufism and being a Sufi are not formal concepts, but informal tags with a vast range of different connotations and connections. And Sufism, I think, bears the same relation to Islam as the beat writers do to the academic English canon, or the Christian mystics do to the Catholic Church. So it's an uneasy, symbiotic, and ultimately deniable relationship. And that's the essential point, because Sufism is the mystical aspect of Islam, and it is opposed by formal Islam. So essentially, you're an outsider figure, you're a renegade to some extent, despite the vast body of poetry and religious material written by Sufis over the centuries. And even we'll see today, Sufis are persecuted, Sufi shrines are blown up. They are the outsider figures. So a perfect person for Richard Burton to be. Now the bulk of the argument, or the things I'm going to say, are derived mainly from the work of Idris Shah and his father Iqbal Ali Shah, who were Sufis intent on promoting and promulgating an explanation for Westerners, because essentially Sufism is projected in the East in an Islamic framework for people for whom the Quran is the law and not science. And of course, for us, that's unintelligible. And the first, I haven't got enough time to really say much, but what I'm hoping to do is replace some of the pictures that we may have about Burton's interests with different pictures. And the best way to do it is really to look at the Kazibar, which is his amazing poem, where he pretends to be a Sufi author, or an enlightened dervish seeker, somebody seeking after truth. Of course it's him. That in itself is a common trope amongst Sufi literature, because the aim is to become enlightened without growing your ego to immense size. And it's even to admit that you're a Sufi is a sign that you're not a Sufi. So you can see the sort of the problems you're getting into in this area. But the thing is, just look at what he says. I mean, really, you can get so much from the introductory bit here to the reader, and especially if you read it through the lens, which is the completely different lens that Burton shines on things, and that's at the back. So basically, the foreword and the afterword contain the keys. And in the afterword, he says, the author himself views life without the comforting doctrine of essential sinfulness. And basically, the whole Western conception of religion, whether you're an atheist or not an atheist, you view religion with the comforting doctrine of essential sinfulness. Man is essentially sinful. And the Easterner doesn't have that. Man is essentially good, and that we're here to enjoy ourselves, not completely, but along the way. And, for example, the idea of knowing thyself, which is a considerable cliche in the Western world as an object. For Burton, for us, if you view it through the essential sinfulness, it's a kind of painful process to know yourself. Actually, it's a pleasure. Knowing yourself is one of the great pleasures. So we see this down as we go through the list. He suggests that affection, the sympathies, and the divine gift of pity, which is empathy and compassion, are the highest enjoyments. It's fun. It's something to be enjoyed. And so once you've got that mindset, it begins to become apparent how Burton behaves as he does. He is enjoying himself all the time, and following another Sufi dictate, which is the idea of passing with action, you try to combine as many things as possible. You're not trying to split things up in an Aristotelian way, you're trying to unify and combine actions. So you can, in this book, try to emulate Omar Khayyam as he was, try to have a bestseller, as he always was trying to do and failing usually, trying to entertain people and also convey the truth. Even the title, The Lay of the Higher Law. The law is the word of Islam, the higher law is the esoteric interpretation of it. And for example, an example of how the higher law, by analogy, could work, there's a saying, bribery, which is a substitute for law, which is a substitute for justice. So you can see this progression. IQ, or intelligence, is the law, foresight is the higher law. So it's the addition of an esoteric dimension to something which is quite ordinary. As he goes down the list, finally, though destructive to appearance, he is essentially reconstructive. Most of active Sufi activity is what's called removing the veils, taking away the veils to perception. The object of Sufism is that we are essentially able to perceive reality. We've got all these veils: the veil of ego, veil of imagination, veils of anger. It is removing those. That is the essential destructive aspect. So if you look at the life of Burton and how he proceeded, we see that, for example, he often courted opprobrium. This is something in Sufi terms known as the path of blame. You deliberately go out to tread on people's corns, create a bit of antipathy in order to polish. What's called polishing the mirror is the idea that you observe yourself without judgment as a kind of a happy experience. You're not trying to say what a bad person you are. And the way you do it is to put yourself into unfamiliar situations, and actually having people criticize you is an unfamiliar situation. Most of us do better as we go through our lives at creating nice situations. Mm-hmm. The activity of Burton, he describes discovery mostly as my mania. And discovery, in Sufi terms, is self-observation, observing what's really going on. That's the inner version. The outer version is observing the world, and they're considered to go hand in hand. And that's why we have an explosion of polymathic activity when you have Sufism, which is carried within the Arab expansion over all over North Africa and into Spain. They carry with them Sufis, because at that time Sufism had an uneasy alliance with the ruling form of Islam. And you have all this expansion of the encyclopedists. They are translating Greek. They did go to some extent to translate the hieroglyphs. They bring Indian mathematics into the Western world through translating it first into Arabic and then into Latin. So an incredible burst of activity, and people who were polymathic. There were soldiers, there were poets, there were scholars, there were linguists. They were exactly like Burton. So once you can see that a part of that movement, that he's actually a westernized version of this, he learned all this, he studied this by being a dervish and reading materials when he first arrived in India, and then carried on throughout his life. The fact that he conceals this or obfuscates it to obvious people is again a classic Sufi maneuver. So once you are able to see that, I'm sure your own knowledge of Burton will allow you to interpret his behaviour in a more optimistic, in a more you won't see the faults, you'll actually see that there's some sort of plan at work. And I mean, the final thing I should say is that another Sufi dicta is things in opposition. Well, the two. The apparent is the bridge to the real. Things in opposition may be working together. So Burton seems to be incredibly attached to some to something he's doing. He's searching for something, he's working on something, he's incredibly dedicated to it, and then he'll just drop it without any sort of worries. And that seems a terrible contradiction, because, you know, if you look at someone like Stanley, who becomes utterly obsessed, he'll destroy others, he'll almost destroy himself in pursuit of a goal. Burton won't do that. He will change at a certain point, because the apparent is the bridge to the real. A bridge can be broken, a bridge can be burnt down, a bridge can be built. All of the activities of man allow you to view the real truth from lots of different perspectives, and that is what Burton is doing in his life. Okay, thank you very much.